So now let's move on to the fourth and final session for today, which is on ethics, data governance, and policy implications of multi-generational research. And I warmly welcome Andrew Sporle. Andrew's a Māori researcher and data sovereignty expert. He has over 25 years' experience in social health research, as well as Indigenous research workforce development. He also works part-time in the statistics department of the University of Auckland. So over to you, Andrew.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Right, just get this on display. Right. Okay, it appears to be displaying okay. Please advise me if it's not. No, my name's Andrew Sporle. I'm an Indigenous researcher from New Zealand, and welcome to a very, very quick sprint through issues of ethics, data governance, and policy implications in multi-generational research. I work with Barry and at the University of Auckland, but I also, as part of Te Roro Tātaranga informatics research program, I also teach official statistics with Barry at Auckland, and I'm also involved with a private analytics company. So very briefly, the presentation that we're going to go through today is talking about policy relevant multi-generational record linkage studies, the different types there are, looking at differential linkage bias, especially for disempowered populations, building on some of what Barry's already said. The emerging importance of data governance for Indigenous populations and what that means for linked data, and how what are some possible solutions for collective data sovereignty for data about families and groups, including but not restricted to the Indigenous data space. I want to build on the work of Cathy O'Neill and her book of about 6 years ago called Weapons of Math Destruction, and her premise that big data increases inequality and threatens democracy. Now, her solution to this was to make the whole process transparent, but that assumes a certain power to change what's going on in the data sphere. And in the Indigenous data space, we're saying, well, actually, there's other issues that and other solutions such as engagement and explicability, accessibility, including governance. And so they're going to be recurring themes for this brief presentation as part of the symposium. So going to be using as an example New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure that Barry has already talked about, and it's an integrated database of databases that are linkable around a spine, and it's got 60-something data sets and counting, and it's very comprehensive. That is now being supplemented usually through research projects where we're linking it to other data resources. So that includes a longitudinal census database, post-census surveys, bringing data out from service data, sometimes putting data in. Research data is going in, albeit in a very limited sphere of use, and data is going out to communities to inform communities. But the problem with this is we're ending up with a really, really complicated statistical resource, and that is decreasingly accessible as it gets increasingly complex. At the same time, we're getting awareness of the data value, and we're getting access to or demand for access to the data, but the high technical barriers are meaning that people are actually, at the same time their interest is peaked, they're actually kept at a distance from it. And so that means that there's a sense that, is this linked data for us or is it about us? So the people who are actually providing the data and about whom the analysis is are actually being further disempowered by the increased complexity. But also, given that some communities actually engage and do interventions at a local level, to what extent are these linked data resources available to inform local interventions? So that the going to quickly describe some of the types of record linkage studies, and the primary type that we started doing was descriptive record linkage studies. And here's an example with the data exchange in New Zealand, where we have a lot of data resources going into a data exchange that are used to inform a community provider in delivering effective resources. And the consent for this is part of the service provision of being involved with that community provider. Then we have the more complicated predictive record linkages, and we've seen some of that today. But here we have groups that are usually defined by characteristics in the data, and the intention is to improve service delivery by improving timely decision making, and the application of modeling based around algorithms related to specific outcomes. Oh, it's frozen. Okay, we have, my system's frozen. Right. Apologies.
So it looks like you are able to move through your slides. So are you okay?
Oh, okay. Sorry. It's just the slide that I'm looking at is not moving. So we have a technical issue at the university end. Wonderful. Okay. So the next type is exploratory linkage studies. And this is where we're looking to discover patterns and outcomes, social patternings of outcomes. And it's useful for rare outcomes, at least in terms of patterning those rare outcomes. But of course, the analytics for those rare outcomes have some small issues. As we've already heard, it can be very useful for hereditary outcomes. And here's a novel way that we're actually being used in New Zealand, where the linked data is actually generated by the families themselves. And here was a fantastic project that was actually done in the 1990s, where they started collecting they already had this Indigenous family from New Zealand already had an extensive genealogical information, and what they overlaid that as part of a research project with cancer histories sourced from lots of different data, and from there they actually then informed a research project that identified a hereditary gastric cancer gene called CDH1, which has now gone on to explain that form of cancer worldwide. So this is one of the novel ways that we can see record linkage. It's not just using existing data, but we're now seeing communities and families themselves creating data that is then linked to other data sources. More about that later on. So in the research, back to the research world, we also see administrative data contributing to other data studies. So this is where the linkage is actually in the longitudinal study, but we're seeing data being pulled from administrative databases that has been into these longitudinal studies, and that's done with the prior approval of the participants. The next type of study is where the longitudinal studies themselves are used to inform analysis of linked data in the administrative data. So the patterning that is with regards to determinants and outcomes that are discovered in the longitudinal study are then seeing they're then overlaid onto administrative data to see if similar patterns, albeit with restricted data sets or restricted variables, are visible. And the kind of work that this has involved is in terms of things like mediation of child poverty, which is a project that Barry was leading, looking at prediction of poor and costly outcomes by region and cohort, and even policy microsimulation. There is a possible extension of this administrative data approach by adding study data into this administrative data. Now that has happened in New Zealand, but it's on the basis of really pre-approved use. So what happens is the data's gone in, but it's been ring-fenced inside that administrative data system in such a way that it can only be used by certain people for a certain purpose and then pulled out. The more permanent addition of research data into these linked administrative data resources presents really major issues of consent for data linkage, because it means you actually have to go and re-consent with the cohort. And where these cohorts are actually familial cohorts, you actually have to engage with multiple respondents, some of whom may not still be alive or contactable. The participants themselves might be too young. But how do you give informed consent when you actually, this is a permanent link and you don't actually know what's going to happen with the data? And one of the issues that we had in New Zealand when this was initially discussed, and it didn't get past the initial discussion, was, is the data governance structure adequate to work through these ethical issues? And as a result, it was decided that that wouldn't actually happen. Barry brought up the point of differential linkage bias, especially for disempowered populations, and that is really, really important in terms of Kathy's point about reinforcing inequality, because if the administrative data is actually the digital footprint from the operation of the state, those people who have had more engagement with the state are much more likely to have a digital footprint. And so some of the functions of the state actually has coercive powers, which include data collection. For example, being arrested and having an arrest recorded usually involves confirmation of an identity, which means that there's a digital footprint for that particular transaction with the state. And so that disempowered populations are much more likely to be involved with those social services that produce data, especially the coercive ones. And this produces issues of data quality in terms of, because the data is not being produced about these disempowered populations in a standard situation. Data completeness, definitely consent, the social license to reuse data, but one of the key points is confidentiality, especially for disempowered populations. And in the Indigenous data space, we have an issue where our Indigenous identities, our tribal identities, are a really effective way of de-confidentializing an otherwise confidential data set. So that, and we can do that. We have an exercise where we say, Google yourself or Google your tribal identities, put your tribal identities in. And if I do that on a Google search, no names, no addresses, no date of birth, not even an age, right? Not even a gender, just my tribal identities. I'm the sixth thing that comes up, right? So in the Indigenous data space, having Indigenous identifiers in a data set really can compromise the confidentiality of the data set and the results that results that come out of the analysis. So this means that, you know, we end up reinforcing inequality because there's differential data access, differential data control, and no doubt governance. There's an information imbalance, and this is really important for Indigenous communities where it is the holders of the linked data that have the comprehensive data about their familial network that they aren't party to. And so we end up with this really restricted or comprehensive, reasonably comprehensive information that is held by another party, but that gaze is very restricted in terms of the kinds of things that the state is interested in. And a lot of that information isn't necessarily strengths-based, it's deficit-based, and is hard to apply in terms of positive change for those communities and families involved. A key point about using linked data for familial and collective research was made by Len Cook. Len Cook was a former government statistician in New Zealand and in the UK, as well as a former Families Commissioner, and he makes a really valid point that analysis and models should be informed just as much by what is not in the data as by what is in the data. And here's a case in point. If we're looking at social outcomes for Indigenous people in New Zealand, right, and we're not aware of the extent to which the Indigenous males in New Zealand were incarcerated, we're not going to understand social outcomes for their birth cohort. And the extent of incarceration was extraordinary. So 73% of all Māori Indigenous men born in 1956 were imprisoned by the time they were 35. And guess what information is missing from the administrative data set? So we cannot actually understand the dynamics and the causal pathways of social and even health outcomes for this group and for these families, but without this really key information on this key determining factor, which is actually missing from the linked administrative data set. So, and this raises the general point that Desi Rodriguez-Lombert makes, that and for Indigenous people, we're actually reusing data that was collected by another entity, like by another nation state, not necessarily for the intention for their purposes and not for the purposes of building Indigenous nations. And so we're now moving into the potential impact of administrative and linked data resources for Indigenous advancement. And we have a Māori academic and senior academic who talks about best outcomes for Māori in New Zealand, the Indigenous people in New Zealand, are basically in two forms: universal outcomes and Indigenous specific outcomes. But the problem is almost all Indigenous data is about, all linked data is about those universal outcomes. There are very few Indigenous markers, Indigenous data sets, and Indigenous variables in the linked data. So if we look at the issues with the linked data resources for Indigenous advancement, they require descent and tribal information, but that needs to be, if it is there, it needs to be handled in a way that doesn't compromise the confidentiality of the data set, but usually it's missing. There are very few Indigenous defined measures. A lot of the measures that are in there are deficit measures because they're from engagement with the state for services rather than development measures. There's they're quite often ignorant of cohort or regional differences in terms of the social history or the context of the data. And then the idea that a lot of this data is individual or collective, or the ability to do collectives like around families don't necessarily reflect the collective nature of this particular community or that Indigenous group. And is this information about outcomes, or is it to inform capabilities? Is it about capabilities for change? Is it about data to empower, or is it about looking at just straight out outcomes? But two really key points for anybody working with this data is in terms of accessibility. How can we make this data accessible to decision makers who aren't necessarily just the state? How can we make it accessible to the people about whom the data is? So they provided it, they should be able to access it in a way that they can apply it to their own decision making. But also in terms of precision, and this is where not much work has been done to date, but if we're talking about those smaller populations, the Indigenous populations, or being able to regionalize or identify regional differences to inform regional interventions, then we are going to hit issues of precision that need to be addressed really quickly and really robustly and in a way that people can understand. And why is this important? For Indigenous people, it's important for us because our population is really, really young. And so we end up with a demographic dividend that although our population is aging, such a huge proportion of our population is young, that any data that informs investment in young children, actually has the opportunity to create a lifetime of dividend for those populations with a really young age profile. In New Zealand, we have Te Mana Rauranga, which is a Māori data sovereignty network, and of which I'm a founding member, and we're advocating for the development of capacity and capability across the whole Māori data ecosystem, which includes Māori data in the state. Now that has actually had some effect, so we've already got some Indigenous values embedded into the data system in New Zealand, and we've got some guidelines for practice. We're also moving into the area of data governance, and there's a discussion now between a tribal leaders organisation, a national tribal leaders organisation, and the government chief data steward, looking at data governance structures to lead the future development of the data ecosystem in New Zealand. That includes the linked data resources that Barry and I have mentioned earlier, and that is now led by a funded tribally run organisation, and already they're presenting and producing new ways to access tribal data that actually not only are controlled in terms of governance, but it's also controlled about who can access it. But its intention here is to make tribal data available for those tribes, right? So that a tribe can access its own data, and it can access data for all of New Zealand, but nobody else can access it without their permission. Now, this approach for data sovereignty isn't just a New Zealand thing. It's supported by international policy, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and the WHO's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health are two of the foundations for this. But more recently, we can see it embedded in the Research Data Alliance. There's a separate section on Indigenous data sovereignty. There's a revision to the Open Data Charter that's under discussion at the moment, which is looking at should data be open by default, or should some types of data have restrictions on the extent to which it's open because there are other interests involved. And even the IEEE has a working group on Indigenous data sovereignty at the moment. All of this is led by the at a global level by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is the kind of head organisation, the umbrella organisation for the local national Indigenous data sovereignty organisations that exist in Vietnam and New Zealand and Australia and lots of other places around the world. And GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, has proposed some supplementary values, some supplementary data principles to inform the use of data. And they're about collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And if we have a really quick look at these key principles that sit alongside the supplementary and to the FAIR principles about fair, accessible, and interoperable and reusable data. These key principles are about collective benefit, that data ecosystems should benefit Indigenous peoples, right? And they should be able to get benefit from that data. That Indigenous peoples' rights and Indigenous data go to the extent that they actually have authority to control the data that's about them. That there is responsibility to those working with Indigenous data to share that data and to support Indigenous people's self-determination by using that data. And in terms of ethics, that the data systems need to actually have ethical systems that reflect Indigenous values. So in New Zealand, we have an approach that our data, our sovereignty, our future, so that we consider Indigenous data as a strategic resource that supports Indigenous flourishing. Now, we're not the only people thinking about this. In fact, the person who designed the prototype for the integrated data infrastructure in New Zealand, Julia Lane, who is a professor at NYU, is actually looking at this in the United States. How do we create data systems that empower those for whom the data is about? And for what Julia has found is that multi-generational data linkage too often is limited to the data resources of the state and implies state-directed change, right, rather than community-level change. So what can we do about it? Well, in the Māori space, we say we need three things. We need information, being able to access and govern information. We need capability to use that information by having some translators, and we need be able to control and design the future. So that includes infrastructure. We have some emerging solutions in New Zealand that look at data governance, data use, data relevance, and data access. So it's right across the data system. And basically, we're developing each of these elements, and we're developing prototypes that address each of these in a way of kind of building separate bits of the jigsaw puzzle so we can assemble them later on. But what's missing? So what's missing in making this work is actually a shared data governance model. So that the intent is, if we are going to be able to empower families, if we are going to be able to empower the disempowered, including Indigenous people, to look and use linked data that is about them, what we need is an ability to store locally produced information and get the linked information from those existing data resources and share that and analyze that in a shared governance, secure environment. And that's going to require possibly additional information, which may come from the community. The community is going to have to access this. There might be new geographies involved, but most importantly, we need to start thinking and having the discussions, really hard discussions, about governance structures, about data oversight, ethics, and data quality, and what data quality means for different people. Because if we don't do this, right, what we going to end up with is this situation where we have a system that is designed for one size fits all, but it's actually disempowering the people that we, who a significant proportion of the population about who are providing the data or who could get value from the data. And that presents some risks to the data system in terms of if the data isn't being used, if the key communities are being disempowered, then the trust diminishes in the data system from the very people who are providing the data. The people who are funding the system saying, well, it's actually getting less and less useful. So therefore the quality starts to reduce. And we can see this in New Zealand, where we're having disengagement by disempowered people with the data system and trying to find new ways to collect comprehensive data about populations. So that's a really quick overview of what's going on in the Indigenous data space with some and with regards to some ethical issues. Here are some really key resources to follow up. Really excellent book called Good Data. There's the Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy book, which is also freely available. And go and check out the Indigenous Data Alliance. And very quickly, thank you to Barry and Eileen and the people and organisations I work with and for. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, very much for that very thought-provoking presentation, and thanks for also concluding it on time. So I don't think we've got any questions. I'm just having a quick look. I can't see any. And so that brings us to the end of today's symposium. It's been a terrific event from many different perspectives on a very topical issue. And I particularly thank our wonderful speakers, Lisa, Amani, Barbara, Barry, and Andrew. We're really grateful to you for so generously sharing the depth and breadth of your expertise. Thanks also to the PHRN and IPDLN for supporting the symposium, and to the PHRN staff in Perth who've made all the arrangements for the event. Last but not least, thanks to you, the audience, who got up early and stayed up late to attend. Please let us know if you enjoyed the event and if you'd like us to arrange similar events on other topics. You can send suggestions to us at phrn@uwa.edu.au. I now close the symposium. Thanks everyone, and stay safe.